le micro. Ah bah, parce que ça passait pas, c'est bon, d'accord. Merci, bonjour, bonjour, je recommence, bonjour, bonjour.
Okay, I'll start again. Hello everybody, thank you everybody for being so in great numbers today. My name is Elisabeth Montefray-Birou from West France. I'm interested in the businesses and their leaders and the young employees for the west of France and for the West France newspaper. I am with Jasmine Manet, who's 27 years old, who's CEO and co-founder of a beautiful association called Youth Forever, which works on the relationship with work between generations. We had Dominique Weston, who's 63 years old, a young president of the Ile-de-France Chamber of Commerce, founder of the Muji, for those of you who know it. Dominique is the one who imported the concept of mentoring for entrepreneurs in Quebec 20 years ago. So a lot of expertise here, and we'll start with this controversy now, and controversy even, with an interesting question on this subject. Generation Z at work. Whom adapts to whom? Is it the employer or the employee? Off we go. So first question: these days, do you think that between enterprises and young employees, do you think duties and rights have changed? No, I don't think so. To be clear, there's always still a relationship between the employee and the employer. What's changed is the whole environment. It's the world in which we live, which is changing at a supersonic speed with tools that didn't exist when I was her age, with different expectations as well. But nevertheless, you do need to have a framework to be able to understand each other and to come to an agreement on what you want to do together. Even though in an employment contract you always have the look of subordination. There we are. Okay, so that means that young people don't have any new expectations? No, I didn't say that. Okay, it's not the same question. Shall I carry on? No? Over to Jasmine now. So, duties and rights of employees and employers. To give a little more information about the association I founded 2.5 years ago, one of our jobs is to be an observatory. We write up studies on the relationship to work with for young people and older people, and we talk about working from home, for example. This is one of the major subjects that comes up a great deal, and I agree with Dominique. There's been a whole set of constraints which have changed the rules of the game a little bit. The number of crises that have to be managed, the demographic crises and political crises as well, as we see at the moment. All of these crises which are changing the rules of the game, and sometimes the law is lagging behind. I'm talking about the observatory because the latest study we published last April was on the constraints for work of the latest generations, where we asked the question, is it the end of long-term contracts? We talked about entrepreneurship contracts. We wanted to see whether young people were interested in this. We wanted to talk about contractual innovation, whether relationships at work have changed. And the answer really was no. What has changed is the presentation rather than the actual content. Okay, good transition now. For you, are employment contracts still adapted to the expectations of young people and their expectations? Do we have to call it into question or not? So today, for those of you who are not legal experts, which was my case until I did this study, employment contracts, the new employment contracts are combinations of previous one. For example, in temporary working, short-term contract uses the rules of previous types of contract. The aim of the legislator is to create the conditions that are as close as possible to realities in the field and provide the best possible working conditions. But there are alignments amongst the youngest people which take into account the constraints of work, the working hours, the working conditions, the tasks to be performed every day, and what you get in return, the salary, stability, retirement pension as well. and the promise is no longer the same. It's no longer kept. And so when we talk about the end of long-term contracts or not, the figures showed that long-term contracts are not disappearing because long-term contracts is no longer the holy grail. People aren't desperate to have a long-term contract anymore as a proof that they've succeeded. No, a long-term contract is a series of guarantees, perhaps easier access to housing and access to a loan when you need one, etc., etc. So a long-term work contract is more a means than the grail itself that you need to be able to obtain. And so the expectations have changed. We're coming back to the fundamentals, especially as the economic situation is changing. And we have to be able to work and have to have some housing and a car as well. That's those are the basics. Then we have to think about the meaning of words we've heard a great deal, and I think we have to specify what kind of young people we're talking about, and where, and when, and at what point in their career. Because a lot of these aspects of these questions have changed. I think we need to keep talking about this concept of the employment contract, which is first of all meaning, and for a certain number of years, meaning has come back into leading position, especially for young people, not only for young people. And also there's a question of adaptation or to have the life that you want to have with flexibility of working hours. We talked about the 4-day working week. You can talk about working from home, of course, and multi-activity clauses and holiday leave. It seems to me, first of all, these are worthwhile aspirations. This is all very well when the company has the means to do it, but should it really be put in the employment contract? Let me give you a figure. And this is what we also have to bear in mind. 97% of businesses in France, 97%, have less than 20 employees. So we are a very big company where normally a lot of young people want to work for a big company. Not all of them, but a lot of young people want to work for a big company. They have the means, the possibilities, the time to build something, and they have offers that are very interesting for their employees. When you're in a smaller company, an SME, it's much more difficult. In 97% of companies, if you do that only fundamentally in the terms of the employment contract, the company is going to have a huge problem. And if they have a huge problem, they're not going to recruit. And that's going to be another big problem. That's an important point to make. Then, meaning is all very well. That's very important. And for several years now, we could say the meaning of work means that young people want to be entrepreneurs and they want to take charge of their own lives. So they want to be entrepreneurs of their own lives, to have their own personal career plan by creating their own company that they can share with others. But there are two different concepts here. There's the question of adaptability. What I think is, I have my own convictions. I think we need to have flexibility. And these young people, because they are intelligent and they are enlightened and well informed, they need flexibility. And they say, we want flexibility. Is it working from home? There are some people, is working from home no longer an option for you? Is it no longer an option for you? No. It's no longer an option. Well, in construction industry, can you do working from home? No. If you're in a restaurant, no. Don't think so either. Okay? So working from home is not for everybody, first of all. Then some people don't want to spend 3 days of the week working from home. Look at the Chamber of Commerce, for example. We have 2,000 employees, for example, and when we bring in somebody who's younger, they have to adapt. We have to help them take up their position, whether alone in their corner at home. It's not the same thing at all. When you're talking about sharing value in a company, what is this? This is a question of money, shares, shareholding. This is increasing a great deal. Is it free time? Is it time for societal commitments that young people are looking for? Or is it something else? Is sharing value, is that a key point, do you think, in terms of the employment contracts? My answer would be the same as Dominique, really. Well, you're supposed to be disagreeing with each other, but never mind. Well, we will find something to disagree on later on, perhaps. But I think the question of flexibility is very interesting because we've often talked about the balance between personal life and life at work, especially for the Z generation. I don't absolutely agree. I think the important thing is better integration, agility and flexibility to be able to tell your friends about your job and be proud of it. The COVID has shown that this is difficult, and when you force people to work from home, this can be difficult as well. Working from home has to be organized properly. One of the problems is that these are advantages, and we are losing the profound meaning of work, I think. I was talking about sharing a value. How do you see that? We're coming back to the fundamental points to do with work. For me, for some people, it might be very important to work from home, and I might want to give more of myself to the company I'm working for or the company I founded. So here, sharing a value is obligatory. You're contributing your own efforts, and so this is part of the value. And then work can also be a way of making a living and making money, and you can have several jobs as well. And sharing a value is different. I might spend 2 or 3 years in a learning process. So I think we have to open up different types of profiles and scenarios, as we have done with expertise in managerial careers. We've enabled some people to become experts rather than managers. So we can have different, more subtle ways of sharing value, more depending on the category and depending on each person's aspirations. So people who want to share value can do so. It's not just a question of money. It's also taking account of different aspects. Young people want to be able to count. People who are my age in the room, some of them are as old as me, they might say, our parents said to these young people, or even the Y generation, he's saying, you're not going to be able to stay in the same company all your life. You'll have to make yourself employable. Of course, the young people are intelligent and well informed at a supersonic speed now. They've understood that. And so they are developing their employability, and they're also very interested in being able to count. They consider themselves to be a specific kind of group. I was talking about this earlier. A study has been published recently saying that 86% of the Z generation consider themselves to be special. Initially I said to myself, well, as a young person, like all young people, well, they're not old, they're young. Well, I was 20 once, a long while ago, but except that there is one very interesting figure for the same question in 1957. A lot of people here weren't alive then. In 1957, compared to this figure of 86% of this young generation who consider themselves to be a special group, the figure in 1957 was 12% for the young people. So there's been a big change. Real need to take into account these special needs. I hope this is clear for the audience. In other case, this generation wants to be important. They want to be able to count.
The risk here is that we turn this into a vocabulary. When we're talking about generations for the last 2 generations, it's become a marketing argument. There are all kinds of youth. But what I wanted to say is that I see a kind of risk of self-realization, of like a prophecy, self-revealing prophecy. The more we talk about the Z generation, and we write articles on their case. I'm responsible also for that, but I know, globally speaking, the risk is that it creates a profile where we recognize oneself. You look at the trends on TikTok, for example. There are Gen Z trends, and I was really shocked by a study I saw. They asked a question to a sample of youth, several questions about what is your totemic animal, and in the answers, there are a large majority of lazy people, the paresseux, the monkey. Sloth. Yeah. Of a sloth. And a sloth monkey. And it creates a realization, since I'm Gen Z, I'm like this, like that, I find it difficult to do this or that. and it locks you up. You know, and the risk of categorizing people is that you create a syndrome, especially in enterprises, where you turn that into policies, and that's where it's very dangerous. You know, you have a policy for the youth, a policy for the senior employees, etc., etc. And I think that's what you have to manage to create, is to open up the debate. Maybe it's louder, maybe it's non-negotiable for a lot of the Gen Z, but how do we recreate this debate? These are questions that we didn't address before, notably when it comes to recruiting. When you don't have the initial salary, the youth don't answer. So the salary grid, what time do you work, your scheduling. So what do you think of this, Dominique? Well, as far as I'm concerned, if I tell you, I'll be quite open. At the Chamber of Commerce of Paris, Île-de-France, we advertise a post, and what I believe is that there's a great diversity in the people who respond to this offer, and of course salary comes in there. You know, there can be jealousies and things depending on what you offer, but I think a good idea is to give an idea of the salary, sort of like a range. But can you have that for all functions? If you want to have the salaries of each of people working in the company, no, I don't publish that. I don't think it's a good idea. So I know a lot of examples, good and counter examples. What we see a lot is the transparency in the wages paid. But try to reduce this gap that you perceive from between the inside and the outside, and the difference between all the different colleagues afterwards. So behind this transparency, you need to be pragmatic and realistic on the capacity for the company to be able to face this. We've talked a lot about equality, and what I hear about with the youth we train is the will to have more equity, to be equality. And we can't be paid exactly the same. We don't have the same experience or the same constraints. If you have a child, for example, if you care for a child, how are you transparent, ensure transparency on the wage policies and how it's reviewed? So the idea is to recreate transparency and be able to ask questions on the topic. And the number itself is not important. It's important maybe when you're looking for your first job. But after that, it's to have a better understanding, have a posture, a transparent posture. So this youth, and it's more and more in the population at large, people don't accept anymore that they're told lies. You know, the youth understand a lot, but don't tell them lies. You know, don't lie to them. Be honest. Sometimes we say something we want to do, and it doesn't exactly happen the way it was planned, but this can be explained. Now, for those who are a little older than I am in this room, there was May 68 in France. It's not all new. You know, once you're in the company, vertical governance is it adapted to the aspirations of the young employee? Well, it's the question of sharing value, who decides, who's associated to the value, and the decision-making process. The question of authority, decision-making process. It's often light is put on that. The traditional management no longer should exist. And you know, there's a trend on social networks right now is the loud quitting. You've heard of the loud quitting. And so it's very American in its approach, but we have examples in France also. You say out loud how you are treated in your company, and it's sort of like a name and shame of your employer. So this shows a new behavior, and it's a matter of respect. But the idea of opening up the responsibility, not necessarily associating the youth, you know, you can't let all the young employees have a decision-making power, but you know, it's a question of consulting, eventually handing over some power. We've done a lot of studies which is called Youth and Power. A lot of examples exist. Just use them to recreate new verticals, if I may say so, and associating youth just for the sake of associating them in decision-making process is meaningless. So I started when I was 24. In my company, The mean average age was 27, 28 years of age. I had 100 collaborators. When I hired people, I went I did not find people that were experienced. Everybody made progress together, you know. I want to change the codes because, well, the real strength of an enterprise is the corporate culture. So you have to have a corporate culture if you want to impose it. And then there's governance and management. And okay, it's true that, you know, the verticality doesn't really work today for this Z generation and others also. As far as the governance, you know, 15 years ago, you know, if you wanted to create a company, people wanted to change the world and they wanted to take hold of society. They want to have to be committed and to have a hold on their future. But the state of mind today is the same. Don't get me wrong. I think the young people want to count today. So another example, look at over 2 generations. We see an evolution. The Y generation, previous generation, came before Z. For 32%, the notion of governance, to be an actor in the governance, it was important. In the Z generation, 42%. So 10 points more in a couple of years. And it's quite encouraging. Yes, they want to be involved in the governance. It's encouraging. If you want just yes people, okay, let's continue like this. Who should transform our world? Who is, it's not me, it's young people, her and them. So with the tools of today, with the things that move very fast, they are digital native. Last question, and we're doing great. And so clearly, it's up to them, these young people, to move, to take action. 97 of the companies in France have less than 20 employees, and okay, we need to do it, but not all companies can do it. You have to accompany the responsibility. Who needs to adapt? Both need to adapt. The young people and the companies. So 2 minutes, and the last question, considering all these aspirations, expectations, up to the management to evolve or the labor laws. You know, if the labor laws force people to do things in a certain way, there's no choice. Yes, just me. What do you think? Well, what you said, it's my struggle, it's my fight. The question we ask is not what advantages, what level of salary you will get, what kind of offices you will have, where you're going to work. The question, the key question is who will do it. We talk about transformation, we talk about technology, demography, politics, environmental transition, youth delegation. Everybody's committed to contribute to turn this world into a world where we want to live. And so in this context, who's going to do it? With what means? What businesses? What administration? So it will play at all levels, and labor laws are laid there. It's a lot of wordy. It's very wordy and very cumbersome. It's not flexible. But I think we have to have a new narrative. There are new ways to ensure entrepreneurship. But for this, we have to make people more responsible, notably the younger, who are the first level, and they don't feel at ease. They're not. They think it's useless. We thank the Secretary of Commission for inviting us, but that's why we're here with the youth delegation, is to try to advocate our convictions and not only talk, but to be heard. And we have a transformation to do. I look at the Chamber of Commerce. We train 72,000 people in 14 schools. ESSEC, HEC, the business school. And so inside all our programs, we have modules for entrepreneurship. We have incubators. We also set up programs around the CSR. It's a duty that we've adopted with our own experience because we have to help them along those paths. And now, who needs to adapt? Both need to adapt. And this youth has to understand that not everything just happens with a magic wand. We need to evolve. There was a question we didn't address here was a question on housing and like that. Michelin in the 50s, Michelin tires, you know, they had housing for their employees, employee housing, and we evolve. Okay, so I'm sorry it's too short, half an hour, but it's a controversy. I think we have paths, we have some orientations. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
Non, non, mais je vais les garder là parce que je vais en avoir besoin. Bonjour.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here in large numbers for this session, which may seem rather technical. We're going to talk about blockchains, Uberization, cyber currencies. Might seem a bit technical, but sometimes it involves our sovereignty. So I think it's a very interesting subject. We'll try to be as concrete as possible. And if our speakers do not do that, I'll try and remind them to make it accessible to everybody. And we'll talk about these innovations which are gradually entering our wallets, whether they're real or virtual, to see whether they're really providing us with new services. We're talking about disintermediation. We're going to explain what that is. And there are banking intermediaries, as you know, but increasingly there are other intermediaries in different companies, different platforms as well. So to give an introduction to this subject and to talk about this subject, we're going to hear from Emmenre, who is a professor of business at the London Business School, who is representing the secular design economist here and is coordinated this session. Then we will hand over to Dan Schulman, who is joining us by video. I hope you can hear me. Hello, Dan Schulman. I hope you can hear us. Apparently he can. Great. Okay. He is the former boss of PayPal for a certain number of years, for 9 years, in fact, during which the sales figure tripled. Then I will hand over to Daniel Biarnet, hope that's the right pronunciation. Daniel Biarnet, who represents the French Association of Business Treasurers. Then we have Maya Attig, who is the General Manager of the French Banking Federation, FBF. Hello to you. And then we have Mingbo Kai, who founded Cathay Capital, a major private equity company, 6 billion euros of assets, including and also involved in a large number of technical innovations in the financial sphere. And then we had Edouard Vieffon, who is the managing director of CCR, which is the Central Reinsurance Fund. And that's everybody, I think. So I'll hand over straight away now to Hélène Rey for the introduction. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So libertarian ideology is floating over finance with Bitcoin and also the other cryptocurrencies. They were invented to disintermediate governments and central banks in particular. But the question now has to be asked, why should we trust these new private sector players who are replacing the governments and the central banks in the area of currency? Bitcoin is the best known cryptocurrency, and it's the one that has the largest capitalization, and it's a cryptocurrency. When you look at Bitcoin, you realize that it is actually a currency which is not a very good currency, in fact, because in terms of the quality of the currency, we need to have low transaction costs. That is not the case. The transactions in Bitcoins are very expensive, and also they're very intense in terms of very energy intensive, and the cost of Bitcoin is very volatile. So it's not really a currency, although it's called a currency. It's really an asset, which is incredibly speculative. Cryptocurrencies can be used and have been used already to get around regulations. There are illegal transactions. There is use of the dark web connected with cryptocurrencies. But in parallel to these innovations linked to cryptocurrencies, we have other innovations. For example, we have other means of exchange, which are what we call the stable coins. These are currencies whose exchange rate is fixed in relation to a normal currency. In other words, in practice, this is the dollar. So the stable coins are currencies which have a value which is fixed in relation, let's say, to the US dollar. And these currencies are used, for example, for international payments, partly by companies such as PayPal and MasterCard and Visa Card, who use them for their international transactions. These are currencies that go backwards and forwards between the traditional currency system and this new system. And as they go backwards and forwards between two, they use these exchange platforms such as Coinbase and Binance, which occasionally are rather opaque and are not very regulated. So the question is, what are the advantages of these new means of payment, and more broadly, other technologies linked to them? We might think that on the one hand they can lead to reductions in costs thanks to these new technologies, and because they're attacking the monopolies of the banks and they're attacking banking rents. But they also have other effects on the stability of the financial system. There are perhaps costs and disadvantages we need to look at too, and perhaps we could also imagine that all of the international transactions might use stable coins in dollars in the medium term. That's possible. Stable coins issued by private sector entities. In that case, the consequences would be quite considerable for the international currency system and also potentially for geopolitical balances. We can see that in parallel to all this, we have the development of other technologies are linked to this. Blockchain, it was very much linked to Bitcoin, but we also have tokenization, smart contracts as well. These are contracts that are intelligent. We also talk about Web 3.0. These are terms that are very fashionable, very trendy, and quite technical. And I hope that in the panel we'll be able to make this understandable to everybody, and we'll be able to explain what they actually are in a fairly concrete way. What are the advantages for society of these innovations, of this disintermediation? In particular, it would be nice to hear from our panelists what are the advantages for people like you and me, and also for non-financial companies. I always ask my students, what is business case for disintermediation of finance? And the answers they give me are always rather vague. Is it really important to be able to do financial transactions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Not necessarily. It would also be a good idea if the panel could, if they can, give a concrete example of a smart contract which is used and which is useful in the intermediated finance and in the real economy. These are not easy examples to find. In addition, we have other questions that can be asked about the use of user data, who stores it, who can use it, can it be sold, and also what happens in the event of the risk of a cyber attack, which has become a very real risk for many companies, most companies in fact. What about traditional banks? We have some representatives of these traditional banks. Are they trying to take control of these new technologies? For example, in these new technologies, we have AI as well, which can give microcredits. In China, we've seen the development of companies such as Financials, which gives micro loans to people who didn't have access to loans before by using increasingly sophisticated AI software. In addition to the central banks, we also see that they were afraid of being left behind because of this new technology, and that is why they have started to experiment with the CBDCs, in other words, the central bank digital currencies, which for the time being seems to be a defensive position rather than anything with a strategic objective from the point of view of the central banks. But in any case, all of the central banks have started to issue these digital currencies. A lot of the central banks have started to experiment and try to see how they can design a CBDC. Does it have to be a retail currency or a currency more for commercial banks? There are a lot of questions being asked about the structure of the financial system and the role of commercial banks. So finally, I think there's an opportunity cost which is quite high in developing these new technologies because they require a lot of talent, especially scientific talent, and also in terms of computational power. They need a lot of energy. They also require a lot of capital. And the question has to be asked, wouldn't these resources be better used to fight against climate change? Thank you, Hélène. I'll hand over straight away now to Dan Schulman. Dan Schulman.
You've been managing PayPal for 9 years. Was it really useful for the people?
Me to manage it or PayPal itself? Look, I think there's a lot to discuss, and I agree with some of what the previous speaker said and disagree with quite a bit of other parts of it. I think there's a saying in the world that it's expensive to be poor. I think that's especially true in the financial services industry. Transactions that for you and me are essentially free cost a tremendous amount for those who have less money. So if you don't have a bank account, if you can't get credit, you need to pay your bills in person. It costs for every transaction. If you have to cash checks, it costs you to go do that. And the system has, I would say, antiquated rails today that keep transaction costs high, and also is to some extent exclusive as opposed to inclusive. And it takes at times days to do a transaction. And when you are, when you have less money, every moment counts. It isn't that your cash inflows are less than your cash outflows. It's just there's a timing mismatch. And so instantaneous payments is extraordinarily important for a large part of our population. And the new technologies that we're talking about, and most of them are misunderstood. People conflate cryptocurrency with altcoins, Bitcoin, Solana, Ethereum, blockchains, CBDCs, stablecoins, and they're all fundamentally different things. Like Bitcoin is never going to be a currency. I don't know why we even talk about it as a currency. It's a store of value. It may replace things like gold or silver. I personally think it will do that. I think its price can go up 5 times from where it is today if it takes half of that market, but it's an asset class only. Altcoins, they're never going to be currencies either, and most of them are scams. Blockchain is a massively efficient infrastructure for doing transactions, but every blockchain is different. The Solana blockchain is perfect for payments. You can do payments at 1/1000th the cost of a transaction. It can be instantaneous and very inclusive as well. And so you can lower costs, drive inclusivity into the global economy, and make things, transactions much more efficient. That's really what a lot of governments and central banks and private industry and the banking sector are trying to do. This is not ever going to be for companies of some scale and size and reputation, an individual thing. This is going to be working hand in hand with governments, with regulators, with central banks, and working across the industry to provide a much more efficient and updated infrastructure. The monopolies of Visa and MasterCard that charge very high take rates to merchants, when stable coins are deployed or CBDCs are deployed, those rates are going to drop from 200 basis points to maybe 15 to 50 basis points, helping merchants, helping consumers. And so I think technology and the advances of technology done in a responsible and smart way are going to make a gigantic impact on the welfare of our economies.
Thank you, Dan. Merci d'avoir respecté le temps.
Thank you for keeping to your time, Dan. Thank you very much. Okay, don't hesitate to butt in whenever you like. Now I'll hand over to Daniel Biane with this very simple question. As you represent businesses through your French Association of Business Treasurers, do you sort out the good from the bad? Do you draw a difference between innovative, useful payments and those that aren't useful but are innovative? Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I think the important thing when answering the questions that Ellen has asked is to look carefully at 3 points. The first point is that the technological innovations in finance, in particular in the flows and payments, there's a huge diversity in these flows and payments. We've talked about Bitcoin and stablecoin, about smart contracts. All of this is linked to the blockchain technology, which is probably the most sophisticated innovation, but there are others as well. There are others that you are familiar with. For example, a lot of people have heard or have already used Paylib, which makes it possible to make direct payments from one phone to another, just using a phone number with a bank account behind that number. But that's true that it makes it possible to do an instantaneous bank transfer. There are other things you're familiar with electronic wallets, e-wallets managed by PayPal or by Visa, MasterCard or Apple Pay. That's really for the general public. Then you have other things that are more for businesses, which we call APIs. These are interfaces that can be connected to banking information systems or business information systems to make the transactions smoother and more efficient. The important thing to bear in mind is that there is a lot of choice. In our association in March, we organized an event called Treasury Innovation Day, where we worked on a lot of fintech with a lot of different treasurers from business, and we had a huge diversity of solutions of technological innovation. When you talk about diversity, you're talking about choice, of course. When you talk about choice, you're talking about different criteria. That's my second point. What are the criteria that a company will select when they want to choose their technological innovations, which they think are going to be useful for them? I think there are 3 criteria, which I put in order of importance. The first one is security. The second is usefulness, and third is cost. First criterion is security. Let's not forget, we're talking about financial flows and payments, therefore, and so we can't take any risks. We have to make sure the money goes to the right place, that the intermediary we're using, because even though it's not a bank, it's still an intermediary. We have to make sure the intermediary is reliable. So the first point is security. The second point is it useful? Is it serving any purpose? Is it going to provide additional services to my customers and increase my sales figures? Is it going to increase my productivity and therefore reduce my costs? And the third point is the cost. Even though is it secure and effective? Is it affordable? This isn't necessarily the case when you're talking about Visa or MasterCard, for example. That's certainly the case. So that's an analysis from the point of view of businesses. Then we have the macroeconomic point of view over these technological innovations. Here we're talking about data which are managed. These are sensitive data about people and their flows. They have to be protected. We have a question of sovereignty. I'm sure you know that most of these major players are American. We're talking about payment flows, and so we can't consider that sovereignty that Europe can abandon. And we also have a question of the economic positioning. With these technologies, the risk we might create dominant players, and in the world of payments, we might create somebody which is similar to Booking.com, where they take most of the hotel margins. We're talking about payments. In other words, everything that nourishes the whole economic environment of the world. So if we look at these 3 points, diversity, the choice criteria, and the macroeconomic impacts, we can try to answer this question. Are there technological innovations that are useful and some others that are less useful? And the answer is, in one word, what's very clear is that technological innovations are necessary, yes, provided they are secure, and so all of the actors have to satisfy the same criteria for security, whether they're banks or not, it doesn't matter. Thus satisfy the same criteria for efficiency and security. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've talked about intermediaries a great deal, which we don't always need. The person representing the intermediaries is Maya Atik. It's over to you. Over to you for the defense. I don't have my wig to defend my position. I'm sorry, I have to represent the old world, and maybe I should point out that our banking federation brings together 330 different members in France, many of which are banks who only work online. The only criterion is that you have to be approved as a credit institution, in other words, to meet the criteria of these banking rules, which are the same for any entity that chooses this status. So that means there are a number of operators who, for example, are payment institutions, and there are technological solutions as well, which operate to carry out the technical part of the transaction, but the flow goes through an institution, whether it's payments or not. When talking about fintech, we have a very large variety of different players. The message I want to get across is there's no contradiction between the fact that you're an intermediary and the fact that you're innovating. There's no contradiction. I would say, on the contrary, I would say that today, intermediation today, as it is done in France, what we call banking intermediation, is something that has an additional effect, in addition to what Daniel Bernet has just described, is a question of the mass, the ability to process the mass of transactions. When you're talking about disintermediation, it's the idea that the individual decides by themselves what they want to do from A to Z. And in fact, I won't to make any reference to political situation at the moment, maybe more to a broader societal situation. Are we in a world of the individual who decides by themselves on everything they want to do, or are we talking about a collective need and the need to have intermediary bodies and people who represent you who are similar to you in one way or another? So today, the major financial players in France today are intervening in the transactions, in the payments every day, and in the financing. In other words, the supply of money to be able to accomplish your projects over a period of time and to be able to interact on a large volume. Let me give you figures to illustrate this massive data, because this France corresponds to a system which is much more inclusive than the one Dan has described to us. Let me give you a few figures. 99.5% of French people have a bank account. Some of them don't have a bank account by choice, and therefore they are excluding themselves. And the average in Europe is 95%. In the world, you have where the country is only 60%. So in countries where you're talking about digital currencies of central banks, CBDCs, these are countries where you have people have no bank account at all. And so you can imagine the kind of countries we're talking about. 1.3 billion loans to 1,300 trillion loans to companies as well. And so I'd like to add to this 1,100 market loans to companies, in other words, loans directly to companies. That goes obviously through the banks. The banks are active on the markets, but not only in that specific area. So these absolutely astronomical figures, and this intermediation also makes it possible to have a pooling. In other words, a type of risk management where the low cost for the major companies compensate for the higher cost for the smaller companies to have rates which are in France much lower than elsewhere. A third point is the question of savings. In France, a large proportion of savings is intermediated by the state, when you subscribe to your retirement pension or your social welfare subscriptions, the government participates, and you add a little part for the retirement pension or for your long-term investment needs. So savings in France is intermediated by the state and by the banks. This means you have a high level of protection. I'd like to end with this specific point, which is the idea of innovation. Of course, you don't have a choice. We've been innovating for a long, long time. Banks have been around for a very long time. This isn't because they've been protected by anybody, but because this is because of their innovation. This innovation is their demand that comes from customers. So it's very important that it should take place in a framework of confidence and trust. That's a very important point. And the second stage, I'd like to give you some more information. These are points where, when you're talking about the investments you would like to do, you want to have 100% trust and confidence. We are a little bit lower than that, but we're much higher than the most of the other actors in terms of the security of transactions and data. Thank you. Mikopai. I've given you a quick presentation. I've been the founder of Cathay Capital, who have invested a great deal in these financial technologies and these innovations. So it seems to be worth investing in these new products. Thank you, Jean-Charles, for inviting me. Jean-Paul, I do apologize. Sorry. We met in Davos a few years ago. I'm sorry for making a mistake with my name. I'll call myself Jean-Paul instead. So the title of this session is a bit of an accusation, really, saying that financial innovation is a problem. Not at all. There's no problem at all. No problem at all with this innovation. At Cathay Capital, we have 4 offices in Europe: France, Germany, and Spain, and New York and San Francisco as well. It was created. We created Cathay Capital 17 years in France and then in Singapore. We have invested. Today, I think we are the largest innovation fund, tech innovation fund in France, even in Europe. We've just leveraged €1 billion. We've invested about 30 unicorns. There are quite a few of those in fintech. Alma in France, for example, Descartes in France, and other unicorns as well. What I wanted to say, a lot of these players are banks and insurance companies. I don't think there's really any subject really about disintermediation. The question of what is useful for the final customer. All of these tech entrepreneurs, which might seem a bit abstract, but often they're young French entrepreneurs who have come out of the best business schools and have a strong desire want to make life easier for consumers. We have for several million people who can buy paying in several installments. When Chan was created 7 years ago in Silicon Valley, they made it possible for 7 million Americans who didn't have a banking card to be able to have access to financial services. This is extremely important, and it's a question of equality. And today, this application is the most downloaded application by the low-income sector of the population. I think it has a positive impact, I think, is fintech innovation. It's not a question of wanting to eliminate any particular player or anything like that. The idea is to provide the best possible quality of service. You can't stop that. You can't stop innovation. The banks finance startups so that they can provide a better service to their customers, and so the big banking groups and the startups are not in conflict. They are working together in partnership, and in fact, we are investing the fintech fund for BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas has been a pioneer. They want to provide the best possible quality of service to customers. so that young engineers and data scientists can provide the best possible solutions. Ever since we now have these smartphones, everybody has a digital identity, which makes it possible to do many things very quickly at a large scale. And it's not just for young people. In e-commerce too, the payment technology are extremely important as well. And for my last point, we have to encourage.
We never accuse, we do to encourage the young people. If they have ideas that can help today, even older people to improve their living conditions, because innovation is also lowering the costs. It's ensuring quality, lowering the costs, and I'd like to indicate that we see that very well. The population is changing, society is changing. We never forget that there's a middle class in the traditional sense of the word, which is disappearing. But on the other hand, you have the population, the people, who have the right to access dignity, to have quality of service, to benefit from quality of service. If you want to serve the people, then you have to use technology. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Edouard Vieillefond, c'était...
Edouard Vieillefond, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And I have 5 points. First of all, we've heard a lot of technology and progress. Obviously, these technologies represent progress. Progress continues. It's even gaining momentum. It's the only way of ensuring productivity, create wealth. And generally speaking, I think we have to be careful not to block innovations just because there would be retributions in the value chain. Obviously, there are, could be quite violent. We see from finance to technologies, from New York to Palo Alto. We've had that for centuries. It's gaining momentum. We have to be careful. But I think that as far as that's concerned, be careful not to confuse the real regulation issues, laundering, fraud, and to mix up the former incomes, that would... So, on the other hand, once we've said this, there are real topics here to address. And these should be addressed technology by technology. Some technologies don't give rise to that many difficulties. But if we go back to philosophy, well, the Greeks used to say, Plato would have Socrates say that writing would give rise to problems because people would not remember things in their minds. Then we continued, we invented printing, digital solutions, and if we had to talk about technologies that, of course, give rise to a lot more difficulties than, we can spend a few hours. It was done in other roundtables on social networks, for example. There's a way to change our cognition and our social relations that has a very much stronger impact and that really need much more regulations than for technology. I'm not even addressing the issue of AI. So we want to go from Web 2 to Web 3 because we want to break this easy income. So, in the story of humanity, there's a collective power. Nobody will have rents. I've never seen this in human nature. In particular, in some places that are in the financial sector, banks, asset management, and everything is normal to be regulated. These are priority issues: payment, financing, credit, and everything. You can't just do anything, and it's normal, traditional that we treat with the shortcomings of the market, constrained with problems, negative externalities, as we politely say in economy. We have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, and it's true that in distributed technologies, we shouldn't have third parties. Well, this is what we used to have in terms of centralization for the supervision and regulation. It's not necessarily bad, but we have to keep a watch on all this. Maya talked a lot about intermediation, so I want to address this. But when we're talking about the system, there are regulations and things to keep a watch on. But when you're really in the nitty-gritty of things and you risk touching the mutualization or intermediation, then questions arise. For example, in banking, if you have a technology that can easily promote methods that kill the normal intermediation, That's what we prefer in Europe compared to the US. That's a real issue, and it's true, and that's my fourth point. It's true that it happens also with insurance and reinsurance. We can imagine that if some technologies favored insurance, the parametric insurance, it's also hopeful. You mentioned the example of Descartes. Of course, we have to continue along those lines, but in the long run, if we segment and if we don't give a strong value to protect it against some perils, well, what will we do? We will demutualize, we will separate the risks, and as you know, in insurances, mutualization and the mass of insured subscribers, it's through the different contracts, and it's mutualization anyway. And the last point that I'd like to raise, because I also represent the CCR, we not only do reinsurance, but we see public insurance for non-insurable claims, that are not covered by private insurance companies. So it's a higher degree of responsibility with the state guarantee. And here we see that the topic that was very important for the demutualization, in our case, it's something else. We are closer to the political instances. It's possible to demutualize and to put our trust in technology when you have a public-private regime that use interministerial decrees to define perils or risks. So it's your turn to address your questions to the panel. I would like to start with my own questions based on my personal experience. I have a banker that I like very much, but when I want to make a payment, they send me figures that I need to recopy on my mobile phone. And inversely, if I use Apple Pay, for example, it's not to replace the intermediate, it's an additional layer, but I just, click with my finger to give my fingerprint, and it's much simpler, much faster. I'm identified, and it seems to be very trustworthy. And I use an American platform, and I feel uncomfortable. Why didn't my French bank have the idea before that? So we're all concerned with this issue of payments. But your part, I think it's 20% of the population that has the chance or enough money to pay an Apple phone. I'm not going to make you guilty. I don't want to blame you because you spend your money on that. But in fact, what you're saying, and I have a checkbook also. Fine, beautiful. But what I want to say is that the question you're asking leads us to wonder, to think about clients, customers. Because you talked very directly by saying all this in the end is to serve customers, is to be useful to customers, and the customers have are very diverse. And I thank Daniel and the FTE for organizing this Innovation Day, because in fact it enabled to demonstrate the variety, the great variety. So you have a lot of enterprises that don't have treasurer or financial managers or CFOs, but the question is, who needs what? And today we answer in a very massive way by saying, well, everybody should have access to Apple Pay and others. But it's not possible for different reasons. Apple makes you pay for that. There's a cost, even if it's a hidden cost. Of course, lucky enough that there's a cost, and that it's paid to Apple or anybody else. But in reality, the issue here is, what are you paying for? What service are you paying for? And I'll bounce off the question by André. Does everybody need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to have access to these transactions? Of course, banks, in a certain way, have benefit from a facility and a faculty to work with a large variety of clients and to select their investments. And you've raised a very interesting question: how do we orient these investments? So, in fact, effectively, banks make choices when they look for performing fintech. Well, we take a fund to find who's going to do it. And when you have to choose between offering a 24/7 service to 100% of the client or a hyper-performing client 24/7 service to a part of the client, people choose the second option because you can't disperse yourself. You can't. We don't have the means here. In France, yes, but not in France, not in Europe. We don't have the means to say, okay, I will only invest in innovation. So I think it's a question of choice. Sometimes the clients are international. It's not a question of 24/7. If you're committed, you're committed with customers all over the world. I understand your worries, you know. When you make your investment, you're very careful. But I can tell you, our customer, the banks, insurance companies, and you are aware of all this. For the environmental impact, of course. And the human impact, which is at the center. Today it's a question of tool. Is the tool performing enough to ensure comfort and ensure general health? At Cathay, we made the choice to invest not in abstract philosophical things. We invest in the tools to have a cryptocurrency that is more safer, more secured, and also how we address the different age groups. So we created a fund specifically for that, and with countries that are recognized by the IMF to provide tools to make these tools as human as banks or traditional financial institutions are. That's the future. So if nobody wants to add anything, I will hand over the floor to you, the audience, and who may have questions or. So the first here, front row, can we hand over the microphone to this gentleman? First question. Okay, Pierre Chambradier, I'm an economist, and I'd ask Daniel Bernays, when you talk about security, are you thinking of the security for both parties in the payment, or the private and public security, to make sure that the people who use money for laundering, for example, purposes, all this has a cost for traditional operators and everything, and it has a cost, so that the cryptos don't pay cryptocurrency. So are you thinking of that in terms of security? Yeah, it's both. So that's why I talked about the microeconomic criteria for enterprises, but also of the microeconomic impacts. And obviously, the payment as such is something that needs to be managed with the same rules and the same controls in terms of safety between the people and public, whatever the operator, whether it's a bank or a fintech or an operator, what have you. Criteria need to be the same if we don't have to have competitive distortions and ill-managed risks. Yes, question in the front here and the lady in the back. Yes, sir. I have a question for Ellen Ray regarding the risk on financial stability that these innovations can give us to. Can you explain what you have in mind when you said that? Yes, well, good question. Until now, regulators considered that cryptocurrencies were a bit too small to really create big risks for the financial system. But now, with the development of these stable coins, famous stable coins, which are assets based on a reference currency like the dollar, and are spanning a bridge between the more traditional financial sector and the new forms of disintermediated finance systems. We see that phenomenon of contagion or instability that could eventually have an impact on banks via exchanges like those I mentioned that are not necessarily entities that are fully transparent. So they can eventually start causing problems. So you have to keep an eye on that as regulators. Also, there are issues with these stable coins as such. We had examples where to have a fixed rate, when you emit a stable coin, on the other side, you have to have exactly the same amount of assets so that it's balanced or considered as stable. And then we saw actors that didn't have the counter value or enough assets to support the value of the stable coins, or even actors that speculated with other cryptocurrencies at the same time and played on the rates, and so that was documented. So in this field, it's a bit of a jungle today, where everything is opaque. We saw spectacular crashes of cryptocurrencies with Terra Luna of the sort. And when it's small and not too connected, well, it doesn't really matter. People do what they want with their money. They can speculate. But when there's a bridge with traditional finance and the banking system, that's worrisome. You have to take a closer look at what's happening. So with these international payments that have developed, we're a bit at this stage. I know there is a question, but I'd like to ask to be patient, because I think our guests here have something to add. Maya, you asked to take the floor, and then I'll hand the floor to you. No, I was just looking for the exact figure of the weight of cryptocurrencies and the assets that were that come from drug traffickers and others. I think that they represent cash that circulated outside the circuit, and crypto assets with a certain number of seizures that triple every year. So very important aspect, and the fight against this trafficking is a major security factor. As I've just made a comment, so that we don't have a confusion on everything, we should never talk about cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies do not exist. They're not currencies. They're crypto assets, not cryptocurrencies. So they don't have the characteristic of a money, of a currency, even if it's a stable coin, because behind that you don't have the required reserves. So don't talk about a currency, talk about an asset. Second thing is that never confuse the crypto asset with the technology, the underlying technology. That's the blockchain. The blockchain can be an instrument that is useful to do intermediations, manage flows more rapidly, but it has nothing to do with what we call a crypto asset. So it's important to establish a difference with that. Thank you. Edouard, you want to add something? Yes, very briefly. In a nutshell, we talked about currencies, pseudo-currencies and everything. And when you have a Bitcoin by itself that varies, well, that was said, the stable coin reminds us of the monetary fund 15 years ago. Or you have the assets or you don't. When you don't, it's a disaster. And in the middle, if you have a basket, for example, you can end up with a system where the tail wags the dog. So this is a comment, and there are three priorities: the financial monetary stability, that's the first. We talked about this. Secondly, is the creation of value. It will exist today. The technologies that pass in the end, they manage, and you recover the value. But in the distribution of the value, will it be captured by the new actors as it was by the GAFAM for Web 2? So there are two underlying questions. The first is the same: will we end up with actors that will, will they change the model in a European zone that doesn't have the same vision of solidarity, whether for banks or insurance? And in the bank and insurance, you can have credits, you have a housing insurance or car insurance that is reasonable. But it doesn't exist thanks to technology. It exists thanks to the mutualization and the compulsory aspect of this insurance. So I'd like to do eventually a survey on this. We could vote. I'd like to have a survey on this, but I promised to hand over the floor maybe for one or two last questions? You wanted the floor. You have the microphone. And Dan after wants to say something. I would like to ask the question to Mr. Kai, because it's true that in France we have the traditional banks and everything, while in Africa, well, it's something that is slowly developing, and maybe financial innovations and digital evolutions can represent a major stake for us in Africa. So what can you say with a view to that, and what are the stakes for Africa? Thank you for your question. 3 years ago, Kate Capital, with the largest African fund, which called Africa Invest, we created Kate Africa Innovation. And one of the key topic of orientation of our investment was in fintech, $120 million in fact. Many French groups, some are present here, participated in this, and it works very well. No, Tony Barry, my associate, is a brilliant financier, and so we have a lot of actions in Africa, and we invested in a company called K2. It's for for lower class population. So, as you know, what's important is to ensure that you are working for the people, and nobody can hurt, can affect you in that way. Yes, Dan, do you want to say something, Dan, please? Do you want to add something, Dan?
Yes, please. I think we're confusing a little bit kind of the where the banking system is, the underlying technology, fintechs. I think every company today is a technology company, and every company needs to innovate as the pace of technology accelerates. I think banks are fintechs, fintechs are trying to be banks, and they're going to start to work together. I believe that every responsible financial services company needs to work hand in hand with regulators. And I think that the regulators around the world, especially in different countries, if you look at Brazil, if you look at India, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore, those central banks and those governments are beginning to put into place public goods infrastructure that run on blockchain that are fundamentally changing the financial system. They're basically trying to tokenize their entire economy. They're putting payment stacks in place that are essentially free. PIX in Brazil is free. UPI in India is free. Those governments are now talking to each other about how can they put their respective payment systems together in an integrated platform through APIs that can enable payments back and forth, not only within one country, but between countries as well. If you overlay on top of that what's going to happen with AI, and I think the next generations of AI are going to be a breakout moment for humanity. I think we are going to move towards API much faster than anyone anticipates. You overlay that on the tokenization of the economy, on top of blockchains, on top of public goods infrastructure, and we are going to see a fundamentally different financial services industry evolve. And this isn't about banks versus fintechs or not respecting the integrity and the stability of the financial system.
Thank you very much.
It's about taking advantage of the technological revolution that's upon us right now.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt. Il reste 10 secondes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have 10 seconds to conclude. We're at the end of the session, so I think the panel demonstrated, Manuel just showed this, the extraordinary diversity of this innovation. Dan also in intermediate financing. We talked a lot about payment systems, but several other things. We shouldn't confuse everything. That's really the key message of this session. It's a very rich ecosystem that is developing at great pace, and I think nobody knows exactly where we're going, but nevertheless, thank you for this conclusion. Thank you for being with us.
Bonsoir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session devoted to the Indo-Pacific. We're going to talk about geopolitics today, this afternoon during our session, and also about the economy and the Indo-Pacific. Is it the artisan of global balance? This is going to be coordinated by Marie-Françoise Renard from the Cercle des Économistes, who's going to give us an introduction to the session. We're going to try to define what is the Indo-Pacific, this huge economic zone, which takes its name from the strategic position where there's increasing rivalry between the US and China. And we're also going to ask the question as to whether the Indo-Pacific can be the artisan of global balance. So I'm going to present our panel members. We have Françoise Nicolas. She's the main advisor for Asia at the IFRI, French Institute for International Relations. We have the new Vice Minister for Investment and Industry from Malaysia, Chin Tong Liu. Thank you very much for being with us, sir. For those of you who don't speak English, don't hesitate to take a headset because we'll have simultaneous interpreting. We have Arnaud Viessier with us. You are the co-founder and CEO of International SOS. And we have Denis Barrier, who is with us. He's a founder and a partner in Cathay Capital. So we're going to start this session with Marie-Françoise Renard from the Securities Economist, who is going to start our session by describing what is at stake in our discussion. Thank you very much. To talk about the Indo-Pacific. What is the Indo-Pacific? It's rather a difficult object to define. It's a recent object. It's a supranational object concept that was defined for geopolitical reasons in order to create a balance between centers of power and also to limit the power of China, it has to be said. So from a geographical point of view, although we can talk about it country by country, it extends from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the US, including the Middle East, China and India. From an economic point of view, it's an area of intense trade, especially for strategic products such as oil. It has a lot of high level of fisheries. This one thing explains another. Because of these resources, it's a zone of potential military conflict in many areas. And the large maritime area is a very high security environmental importance. The increase in economic and especially military power of China has led the major powers to define an Indo-Pacific strategy, whereas up to now we tended to talk about Asia and Pacific. The European strategy is less based on conflict than the US, since Europe, of course, like the US, wants to strengthen its position, but it's also defending an international order based on respect for law, especially concerning maritime navigation, also based in cooperation and the principles of cooperation on subjects such as fighting against global warming, the effects of which are particularly deleterious in this region. So when we're talking about security in the seas and of the oceans, this is important for the trade flows between the different ports in the region, and also it ensures we have guarantees on procurement of the different natural resources. So freedom of navigation is absolutely vital, and that's why efforts are being made to fight against terrorism and against piracy. Certain areas in this region are particularly crucial, and there is particular tension, where there could be an interruption or modification of the Silk Road. For example, if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, this means that Taiwan Strait would be impractical, whereas it's a crucial trade route. A huge number of container ships go through this strait, and this means that there's a trade in oil and semiconductors as well, which goes through this area. In the same thing, another difficult point is due to the discovery of oil and gas, explains that China has taken control of the sparkly Paracel Islands with repeated incidents with the Philippines and territorial demands from neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia and Vietnam, etc. So theoretically, we need to count on negotiation and diplomacy to be able to overcome these difficulties and differences. Also, the Indo-Pacific region, if we exclude Russia, also comprises 3 UN Security Council members, but there is no governance institution which makes it possible to guarantee freedom of movement, which makes it possible to define security rules, which would be recognized by all of the countries in this zone. The advantage of this zone is a result of the disorganization of the international system as it was defined at the end of the Second World War. That's why this is because of the end of this system that this area of the Indo-Pacific has increased its influence because of the desire for security and the fears for security. Of course, it's the largest free trade area, agreement. ACP includes the areas inside this area and outside this area. But the only thing that can encourage us to be optimistic is the creation of institutions and new institutions and a new order leading to the creation of a new framework and new rules which would include protection of the commons. And it is institutional organization which we hope will replace an international order which has disappeared in this area and which needs to be rebuilt. If we're being optimistic there, yes. Françoise Nicolas, to react to what Marie-Françoise has just said. In fact, in the end analysis, we're talking about Asia-Pacific, where this has changed now to Indo-Pacific. Is this for geostrategic reasons or political reasons that we've changed from a free trade area to countries who want to define their strategy from a geopolitical point of view? Yes, well, we have changed our terminology. We're no longer talking about the same thing. Until now, we talked about Asia-Pacific, and Asia-Pacific was more or less Eastern Asia. Asia-Pacific is an area that brings together the three major countries of Northeast Asia, China, Korea, the Chinas, that's not very politically correct, but that's what we're supposed to say, which means China and Taiwan. Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. There are two Koreas as well. We'll forget about North Korea, sorry, but we won't talk about North Korea. They're not really included. So Asia-Pacific was that group to which we could add Australia and New Zealand. So this area was economically very well integrated, in fact, because the regional production networks were organized on that scale. And in a very interesting way, as Marie-Françoise has just reminded us, this region had just had its own institutions created because of the large economic partnership, RCEP. These 15 countries are now part of a huge free trade agreement. When you talk about the 15, the 10 from the ASEAN, the 3 from Northwest Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. So it's an island that does include China. Yes, the RCEP is Asia-Pacific for me. For me, this is an area which economically has a real meaning, which is structured in effect, and which has been structured institutionally thanks to this agreement, which is more than a free trade agreement. There are many other provisions in this partnership, the RCEP, which concern investment and goods and services and SMEs as well, lots of other chapters apart from the free trade area part. So this area really does exist. The Indo-Pacific is something that is more vague. I would say it's a non-identified geopolitical object, an OVNI perhaps, unidentified object. It's to define this area, we have China, which may or may not be part of this zone. We have all of the Indian Ocean, right up to the east coast of Africa, or not. If you're an American, for you, in the Indo-Pacific, basically, as we say traditionally, goes from Hollywood to Bollywood. So it stops at India. If you're Japanese, in that case, you emphasize the two oceans, the Indo-Pacific, as the name indicates, underlines the fact that there's two maritime spaces, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and in fact they are connected, as Marie-Françoise said. It is through this huge area that most of world trade takes place, 40% of GDP worldwide. So in this Japanese version, then for Russia it has more of an economic sense. It is the area through which this trade goes. But there's no institutional structure at all for the Indo-Pacific. It all depends on how you envisage these different countries. And the last point is that the US have returned to this area because they had neglected it, moved out of it in economic terms. They had been very present in terms of security with the famous agreement, security agreement with Australia, which led to a lot of talk in France for the reasons we are familiar with. There was a Trafalgar, it was a betrayal by Australia. So the US have been very much present in terms of security, but not so much in economy. So they are back now with a new economic framework for the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific acronym. English acronym. So as part of this, they don't want to include China. We have the US. We have the main 5 economies of ASEAN. We have the Fiji Islands, rather surprisingly. We have Australia and New Zealand. We have Japan, Korea, and that's all. But not China. Above all, they don't want China. So Indo-Pacific is rather strange. For me, it's an economic reality for the reasons Marie-France has explained, because of the considerable world trade that goes through that area. So in that sense, it is a reality on the geopolitical level. It depends who you're talking to. Each country has a different point of view. We'll ask the Vice Minister of Trade and Industry from Malaysia, because Malaysia is a major country in this area, Mr. Chin Tong Yu, and which has always tried to be independent between China and the US, despite its proximity to China. How do you define the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize for not being able to speak French.
It's okay.
The idea of Asia has a long history. The idea of Asia started in the late 19th century, and it is not just a geographical idea, but it was also adopted by Asians as something that is not West. So you have Japan adopting the idea of Asia, you have India, you have China, you have the Philippines, you have many of those countries during their anti-colonial struggle adopting the idea of Asia. So Asia is now an idea that was adopted at least for a century, for many countries. But the idea of Asia Pacific came around the late 80s, early 90s. Came with a very optimistic view about the world, about trade, about relationship with China. And therefore, in the 90s, there was this creation of Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. So that came from a rather optimistic era of trade of China. But we are now in an era which is less optimistic, and we have this idea of Indo-Pacific. The idea of Indo-Pacific, to a large extent, is number one, originally driven by the US, as the United States always has an Indo-Pacific command. So with some military undertone, and with China as a target. But secondly, it has also a lot to do with Japan and India. And in order to bring in India into the larger questions, and as you know, as a result, Quad was formed. Quad was formed in order to include India. So it was United States, Japan, in India, and Australia. So Quad was formed in order to give basis to Indo-Pacific. But India, in many ways, is actually a multipolar player. Modi just visited Putin, and you have India, actually half of India's defense assets is actually from Russia. India is entirely with the United States when it comes to China. However, when it comes to other politics, it is not necessarily 100% with the United States.
C'est du non-alignement.
Sorry?
Oui.
It's a non-aligned country.
Sense of non-alignment in Southeast Asia, in India, or multi-aligned. Either you are in non-aligned or multi-aligned. The non-alignment movement started in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia. And it has been part of Malaysia's foreign policy outlook. It has been part of many Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN, where we think that the world, we want to in order to prevent the world from bifurcating, it is important for as many middle as possible. And this is, in this context, I think France and the European Union has an important role to play.
Thank you. Arnaud Vessier, une réaction.
Arnaud Vessier, a reaction with International SOS. You are specialized in health sector, and security sector who work a great deal in China and also in Singapore. How do you define this area? Is it kind of land of opportunity, do you think? The Indo-Pacific zone is the zone of the future, but of the present, especially of the future, in economic terms, because that's where you have the highest growth rates. Is still the case now? Southeast Asia is enjoying strong growth, and Northwest Asia and Vietnam is enjoying very strong growth, and of course, obviously India, as we all know, has a remarkable growth rate. As for China, the growth has slowed, but it's still extremely respectable, and China has great capacity to catch up despite the geopolitical issues. For us at International SOS, our job is to help employees of companies and governmental employees around the world in terms of their health and safety. We are world leaders in that area. The specificity is that we began in Singapore. The group was created in Singapore. I lived there for 14 years. My children were born there. So I've lived in Southeast Asia for a long time. And so this progress we've made, we started from Australia to China. We're in 24 Asian countries, and now, of course, in India, which has become an absolutely key country with the specificity of Singapore. Yes, the specificity of Singapore, which is a bridge, in fact, between the US and China. Because the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who is a Singaporean de Gaulle in a way, Lee Kuan Yew was one of the first to realize that China was going to become the future major power. And today, 74% of the population are Chinese in Singapore. To get into university, you have to speak Mandarin in Singapore, whereas previously Singapore was developed in English. So what does that mean? The Chinese have taken over and have taken over more power? Well, there's been a balance in Singapore with the US because they are economically aligned with the US in Singapore. And there's also a military alliance with the US and an economic alliance with China, which is very important. So to do this, Singapore needs to get closer to other countries. It's a very important driving force for ASEAN. The minister here is a very important player in that. Also, motor of an alliance with France. There's a strong partnership with France as well, because Singapore wants to be close to Europe and to France. So it's a very complicated set of balances, which is very important for Singapore's survival, which is a very open country, open to trade without any customs duties, and is growing very, very remarkably, but with at the same time having to deal with a lot of geopolitical tensions. Do you invest? You invest in startups and small Chinese companies in Singapore. So despite these geopolitical tensions, you're continuing to invest. Is it also an important economic area for you? Yes. Let me share with you some of the excitements and the opportunities we have as a worldwide investor, and why the Indo-Pacific is perhaps the greatest opportunity for investment, and it will be in the future years for us at Cathay Capital. As you were saying, I think it represents 40% of worldwide growth. The Indo-Pacific, everybody's looking for growth at the moment, and it's the place where you have 40% of worldwide growth. We were saying the US is starting to become interested in it in economic terms because they've also seen this. What's happening is that it's a place, if you look at Southeast Asia, where very few people have access to basic services, especially financial services with banking cards and insurance, that we are all used to having. So what they're trying to do is to do leapfrog. Instead of going through the step of a traditional banking, they have their phones and they can directly have access to a digital bank, and they can get insurance. Which countries do you mean? The country where it works the best is Indonesia. We have 270 million inhabitants in this country. So it's very dynamic, and services are developing very, very well. And then they are developing the other area, the rest of the other area, especially Singapore, which has a very rigorous financial system with very strong and robust rules for the financial activity. So you have this financial hub, and you have this growth volume, which is absolutely massive. And finally, we also talk a lot about sustainable development. And in this sustainable development is perhaps the area where you have the greatest sustainable development. You might have seen that in India, they have huge pollution issues. In Southeast Asia, they're close to the water, and so if the water level rises, they have real issues. And so all of this development has to be done, and they're being asked to make huge efforts. It's us, in fact, who created this problem initially. We're now telling them to develop without using carbon. And so this is one of the largest areas in terms of industrial decarbonized development, and certain countries such as Malaysia, I'd like to highlight this. Malaysia has done exceptional work. We have the Ministry for Foreign Investment in terms of semiconductors. Everybody talks a lot about Taiwan, but once you talked about semiconductors, you have to package these semiconductors and everything that goes around that. Malaysia, for example, is becoming the leading country in the world for packaging of semiconductors. I just wanted to share that with you, and the excitement we have about this region we're working. So you're still enthusiastic. So, Françoise Nicolas, it's interesting to see that on a geopolitical point of view, we're looking a lot about the tension around Taiwan. As you said already, all this sparkly islands that Marie-Françoise mentioned, where China wants to take control of certain maritime areas. There's a lot of competition. We know there's a lot of tension also with the Philippines, strong tensions with military movements. How do you explain these tensions, and how far do you think it can go? When you listen to the panel, we get the impression that economy plays the most important role, but nevertheless, the tensions are increasing. And this is because of the rivalry between the two superpowers, the US and China. Yes, that's true. We do have tensions also between the economic outlooks in this area, which are very, very bright. That's where everything is happening. That's where the actions are occurring in this Indo-Pacific area extended to China. This is where a lot of the world growth will take place. So clearly, economically, it's very, very promising. Geopolitically, it's much more complicated. And exactly, the two things are linked. The reason why there are tensions between the US and China in this area is because this is exactly where most of the worldwide growth will take place. So everybody's interested. If there are economic promises, there is a lot of jealousy and a lot of interest. There's a tension between US and China. Up to now, it had been the US that was playing the leading role in this area. China has emerged, and now China believes that most of the South China Sea belongs to it, and the East China Sea belongs to them. And for them, this is part of Chinese sovereignty. Not everybody agrees with that. But it's true that there are tensions, and so these tensions have been exacerbated because there are very strong growth outlooks. And as I was saying earlier, what's interesting is that America's always been very active in the area of security with the Quad and the Focus, and all of this has been led by the US up to now. Now they realize they cannot stay at the same level of just focusing on security and nothing else with the countries in the region, particularly in the Southeast Asia. They regretted the fact that the US had pulled out economically. The withdrawal of America from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which the US itself had set up, that's because of Trump. The withdrawal that was launched by Trump was seen in a very negative light by the Southeast Asian countries, and so we have a return of America now, but the return that they're putting in place is really against China above all, because I was saying earlier in the economic framework of Indo-Pacific, China isn't really included. So we have this tension between the geopolitical sphere and the economic sphere. Mr. Ching Tong Liu, in Malaysia, you were saying that Malaysia is trying to have this strategy of being non-aligned, so you have investments from American companies, and at the same time your main trade partner is China. Are you sometimes afraid of China?
Malaysia is not afraid of anyone, but we are worried about the world that becomes bifurcated because we are with both sides. Malaysia constitutes 7% of global semiconductor trade, 13% of back-end semiconductor trade, and 23% of US semiconductor trade. So United States semiconductor trade of which actually 23% comes from Malaysia's export. Thus, we are closely linked to the US economy. At the same time, we are also linked to the Chinese economy.
Surtout, vous êtes beaucoup plus près.
Much closer.
Quickly.
Well, we're not necessarily closer just to China because a lot of those trade eventually end up in the United States. For example, the semiconductor trade, a lot goes to China from Taiwan, Malaysia, then to China, and to be sold to the US. So that trade link is very, very well linked, but now there is a challenge. The challenge is Chinese technology has grew too fast, very fast, whereas the US middle class has shrunk. And therefore, US has problem buying or consuming what is being produced in China and Asia. And the US, because of the US shrinking middle class, this idea that United States can forever be the consumer or importer of last resort is now being questioned. And that's where I think Chinese economy, Southeast Asian economy will have to rethink. Malaysia wants to be a middle-class society. We are still a triangle society where the poor is bigger than the middle class. But we want to have a bigger middle class. We want Southeast Asia to have a bigger middle class because with a bigger middle class, we become a market and not just a producer. And that, I think, is the framework that we need to change. And we need Southeast Asia to be richer so that we do not depend on just thinking of selling to the US.
But when there are tensions around Taiwan, quand il y a des tensions autour de Taïwan qui sont liées justement au mouvement.
When there are tensions around Taiwan because of Chinese behavior, how does Malaysia react to that? Or the sparkly islands, how do you react to that? Do you feel threatened by China sometimes?
We will have to engage China. We engage China. This is not the only issue that we are dealing with China. There are a basket of issues that we have to deal with when we talk to the Chinese. But what we are hoping is to influence the Chinese that they will have to see that the South China Sea is not a competition between the United States and China. We are hoping that we can convince them. Not easy. But secondly, even if the Chinese see the South China Sea as a competition between China and the United States, they will have to see that the neighbors, their territorial difference with the neighbors shouldn't be the main challenge. They should desegregate the challenge. What I think is a problem now is because it is being perceived in China that anything that has something to do with South China Sea is tied to the competition between US and China. I think there needs to be decoupling the territorial differences, territorial claims between China, Malaysia, China, the Philippines, China, Vietnam, has to be differentiated and decoupled from China-US competition in the South China Sea. Because otherwise, when all this is entangled, it would not be good because it may entangle with Taiwan as well. It's all part of the package.
Vous vouliez peut-être réagir, Arnaud?
Would you like to react? And Arnaud about this idea of decoupling. It's the US have put in place a containment strategy of China. And this is something that is felt very strongly in this region. Here the minister is saying with no containment, we have to look at this country by country and look at these things separately. So yeah, as an economic player, how do you see things? The US have done what they called a Pacific tilt. They pivoted towards the Pacific, which is the essential policy of the US, and its policy has three levels: military, economic, and diplomatic. On the economic level, they have this re-engagement that we've just been talking about. On the military level, they have a redeployment in the Philippines particularly, but not only that, and especially in all the Pacific islands with Australia, where there's a very strong competition with China there too, to regain influence in each of these small countries, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa, etc. Papua New Guinea, where the Chinese were taking up strong positions, and the Americans and Australians are now pushing back and taking over, not the control of these countries, they want regaining influence again in these countries so that they will be these countries will be aligned with US instead of China.
So the decoupling is necessary because it's the growth, the zone of growth. Americans are investing a lot in Vietnam. They're investing intensely in India and the Middle East. The Middle East, Indo-Pacific, depends on the definitions. You know, if those regions belong to Indo-Pacific zone. That's where the investments take place. And in Indonesia, there's a spectacular growth. Indonesia is becoming a powerful country in Southeast Asia and is pulling out of its underdevelopment. You know, that was very strong for a long time. So they're really growing. So there needs to be a decoupling, but it remains the zone of tensions. And enterprises today are used to living in permanent crisis. Countries are used to living in a permanent state of crisis, where there are successive crises that overimpose. It's not because of crisis that we stop. And so investments will continue everywhere. Only in China, maybe foreign investments are stabilizing. But this is for domestic reasons. That is, the power in China, Xi Jinping, has decided to proceed with sort of... When foreigners complain that they're mistreated in China, it's not true. It's not the foreigners, it's the whole of the business that is mistreated. Xi Jinping decided that the business should be subject to the party. And the private business is now controlled in China. And so international investments, whether French or what have you, German or US, has stabilized in China and will tend probably to drop. But remaining at levels where the stocks are very high. It's important to understand that the political vision of Xi Jinping is that he wishes to control the private sector. He has overtaken the control of tech companies, replacing the charismatic leaders, the founding members, by leaders that are less known but control. Is that good for the Chinese growth? Well, a priori, I would say that for us liberal countries, it's bad, but in liberal economies. But it would be rational and logical that the Chinese growth be less efficient in the future from the moment the state regime is less pro-enterprise. And we see foreign investments today are in a pause. We've stopped. And so we can all hope, if China continues to grow as fast as in the past, it will continue to grow. It will continue to grow. The problem is not that it will stop, but will it be on the same slope as before, that is from 6 to 10%, or is it on a new slope of 3 to 5%? Which is the case today, which is an enormous difference because the U.S. Themselves have 3%, so there's no catching up of China on the U.S. Denis Barrier, so you insist a lot on technologies, you invest a lot. Does this geopolitical context have an impact on your choices? Yeah, well, we talked about decoupling, quite interesting because it's maybe the region where we've considered that it's not necessarily in a decoupling state. So we don't have the choice between China and the US for the moment, and for several reasons. First of all, we talked about security. Well, the military alliances that exist, everybody chooses its camp, but it's not as essential as in other regions of the world, it's not as critical. And in the end, it's a region where there's no war for the moment, as there is in Europe. There's a war next door. We talk about China and Taiwan, but historically, when did China declare war to a country in its history? Well, not often. Not often. China does not wage war. So there are tensions for different reasons, but it stays reasonable when you're concerned as an investor. When we talk about the population, there's a Chinese population that's strong. We said in Singapore, Mandarin Chinese became a reference language. And at the same time, we see the Chinese investing intensely on the supply chain. So they want less supply chain in China. So one of the zones where they can apply their supply chain deploy their supply chain is Southeast Asia, while China is automizing its supply chain because they have a problem with the pyramid of ages. It's an aging population, so they're trying to automatize everything in China. They're investing massively there. And China, for its electrical cars, for example, with the zone that is strongly developed, Indonesia, with a population of 270 million. So investing massively. And same as when we create activity when there are exports. So it's not. So of course there are tensions, because there's competition. But as far as an investor is concerned, given the growth, it's interesting. So Françoise Nicolas, Indo-Pacific, can it be an artisan of the world balance? We talk of tensions, yes. But there is this question of Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan. Xi Jinping talks about Taiwan very often. We will military take action within 5 years. In the discourse, it's stronger and stronger. So could there be a war? Would the U.S. be involved? We're not talking about North Korea because very often we hear threats, nuclear threats. Japanese are working on shelters and everything. So everything happening around Taiwan and everything happening around China is not negligible. No, it's true. It's a zone that is tensed. But maybe a first point on the risk of a war between China and Taiwan, honestly speaking, I don't believe it'll happen for many reasons. But I think that the key reason is that China is much more ready to engage into a low-level conflict and eventually take over the control of Taiwan, but without military action. So we will choke, slowly but surely, Taiwan to try to take over Taiwan again. I think it's more plausible, more rather than thinking of a military attack. I think they will, I hope I'm right, but just to say that there are tensions in this region, in this zone, that's unquestionable, but this being, like operators say, it's a growth area, a zone of growth. And if I want to answer a question, can Indo-Pacific region be an artisan of stability? I would say no and no again. First of all, in my opinion, as a geopolitical analyst, the Indo-Pacific zone is not an actor. It's not a player. It's a field where a lot of tensions take place. Where, of course, the essential part of trade happens, but it's not an actor. So it cannot be an artisan. So I say no on the first segment of this question. On the second aspect, can it be an artisan of stability? For the reasons I just gave, I say, I don't think, no. I think I only see frictions and tensions. But again, I will say that if growth is a stability factor, well, yes, this zone is a zone of stability. But the Japanese strategy in the region that pushes what Japan calls a free and open Indo-Pacific, it has as a goal to guarantee the stability of this zone, guarantee the freedom of sailing, of shipping, guaranteeing that trade will continue to take place freely in this zone, and this would stabilize the whole of the global economy. So if you're on the Japanese side, you can answer yes. But otherwise, if you look at that without taking sides, this zone is not an actor, it's just a place of confrontation. It cannot be a factor of system stability. Jean-Jacques, can you react to this, to what Françoise Nicolas just said? Can it be a zone of stability, Mrs. Ching-Chong-Liu, like the vision of Japan, this Indo-Pacific area?
Indo-Pacific, I agree with you, would not be an actor, and it's not an actor. But ASEAN, which is an organization that has 10 member states, ASEAN, together with many other non-aligned actors, maybe Brazil, maybe Latin American countries, and at some point on some issues, EU, France, these actors will be able to be artisan of global balance. We may enter into an a la carte world where we are no longer tied to alliances very strictly, but we are entering into a more a la carte menu where countries chooses issue to work together. And we want to see that. We want to see that middle becoming strong and therefore preventing bifurcation of supply chain, preventing the world being bifurcated.
Arnaud Vessier, un monde à la carte, c'est ce que vient de dire M. Ching.
An a la carte world, you know, by the menu. We didn't talk much about France. You know a lot about the relationship between France and Singapore. France is at the origin of this diplomacy, of the sort of like an equilibrium balance in this region. Is it meaningful? Well, yeah. I think that the Indo-Pacific is not the artisan, but it's the stake of world balance. That's where it will happen. Because in the U.S. opinion, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific is much more important than what's happening in Ukraine, despite the American engagement in Ukraine. Their real concern is Indo-Pacific for the U.S. relationship with China, with India, and with the whole of the countries of this zone. For us, France, if we are on the lateral side, we have a real problem. Numia, New Caledonia. We have an island that is destabilized, where we haven't managed to take over control. We have more and more police forces there, and the security situation is absolutely out of control. And it's a good example of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, that there is an influence, a foreign influence. We talk about Azerbaijan, but probably a mix of Russia and China behind all this to try to destabilize Numia, New Caledonia, and question the French presence in the Pacific. And it's not obvious that we will manage to recover control of New Caledonia. So we see to what extent this tension through the entire zone, which is the largest in the world and most densely populated, and with the largest economies, because the world economy today is the Indo-Pacific zone and the U.S. And you have 80% of growth is located there, if not 90% of the world growth, the global growth. That's where it's happening. And so we clearly see this unbalance country by country. We are very present because we have the vision of what's happening. We accompany governments and groups to implement their strategy in the field of security and health, and to use our own staff. So we see how they operate. And today, this tension exists practically everywhere. ASEAN can be a stability factor because the ASEAN is pro-US, but quite neutral, finally. And it's the zone that can, yes, bring forth a balance, and I share your point of view on that. And even for us, we're based in Singapore and in KL, in Kuala Lumpur, which is a very important economic hub for us. We have 500 staff members in KL. It's our regional headquarters. But we see that we are in a period of total transfer where the geopolitical balances are changing, shifting. Taiwan, well, I share the same opinion to say that the U.S. would probably not attack or wage war on Taiwan. But on the other hand, there's a possibility that of misunderstanding between the American fleet at risk and China. Something that can happen anytime, you know, a match can light it up, so it's very difficult to measure, very risky, and that's where there's a risk, and it's a real risk, and that would really question growth, put in question growth and the balance if there was a conflict around Taiwan. Well, look at Ukraine. It has an impact on European growth, but it hasn't totally put in question European growth. So it depends on the U.S., the reaction of the U.S. But if there's a real conflict and American sanctions on China, that's another story. we're not there yet because clearly it's not what the U.S. want, and nor do the Chinese. The relationships are much better than 12 months ago between China and the U.S. Yes, okay, I agree. If there's a conflict, it will be the result of a mistake, an error, an incident. But it would have an immediate, colossal impact on the world growth rate and global exchanges, because it's through this zone, in this zone, that all the trade takes place. Now, contrary to Ukraine, I think the impact would be much stronger and much more immediate. Denis Barrier? Well, I'm an optimist. So I'm in technology, so I'm an optimist. So I have to be an optimist if I'm in technologies. And we talked about France. Well, it's a zone where France is strongly present, has a strong presence. And we also talked about the economy of nickel in New Caledonia. So it's a place where France has a very important natural resource. I'm thinking about New Caledonia. But so from that, we have something. We have a word. We have a presence, and to ensure that these tensions, general tensions, do not worsen. I would say that the actors of the zone are busy on that. We see groupments. We're used to Europe, but now we see a lot of initiatives with the different countries. People are trying to talk about eventually common currency. This is being discussed. So we're pretty far from having this sort of like local euro. But there are ideas that are being discussed of fusions, merging, free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. And so, but they're not separated countries, but it's sort of like a community of Indo-Pacific community that is being that could exist, and it can contribute to the world stability. Notably because nobody wants to hinder economic growth, global economic growth. So we pay attention to what's happening, but I think that we can participate, we can be active there, and I think that we can participate in the world stability. Mr. Liu, can the European community be an example, like in terms of integrated regionalization? Is that an example?
That ASEAN, Malaysia will be chairing ASEAN next year. We hope that ASEAN will be a more prosperous place. We hope that ASEAN will integrate and increasingly become a common market, learning from EU. But at the same time, it's important that we in ASEAN have to change the way we think. Because for many, many years, American companies and European companies come to ASEAN and tell Malaysia, you're competing with Vietnam, Malaysia, you're competing with Indonesia, Malaysia, you're competing with regional countries. I think we in ASEAN will have to move away from thinking that we are competing with each other, but see that we are one supply chain and we are one common market. That will mean that we will have to start thinking of setting a floor on competing to race to the bottom on wages. We have to set a floor so that we don't compete to race to the bottom on tax incentive for companies from, say, Europe or from US. And we'll have to set a floor so that we don't race to the bottom on destroying the environment. All this required new thinking, and I hope the new generations of ASEAN leaders will think so. But message for France and for Europe is, it is in the interest of France and Europe to spend more time on Southeast Asia. To understand, to spend more time on Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, whatever you call it, because there is a lot that will happen there. There's a lot that is already happening there. There will be a lot that will happen there. And it's important that we get more engagement from France and EU. And it's also important that EU and France see that region as a potential future market, so that there's a need to enrich Southeast Asia, to make Southeast Asia richer, and it becomes a market for the world. Thank you.
Vous voulez réagir?
Yes, je partage complètement ce que vient de dire.
I share totally what Ching Tong Lu just said. Fully agree. There's a lack of engagement on behalf of France for Asia. France is engaged with China, and starting with India, but globally the French commitment with Asia is insufficient. Why? Well, because it's too far. Because we don't have, Vietnam. Well, we wanted to engage around Vietnam, but Vietnam today is not under French influence, far from that. And it's Singapore that is the country, the hub with which we have the most contacts. 2/3 of our investments are from Singapore. The stock is essentially in Singapore. So we need to be more involved. There are few ministerial visits. When you compare the German and the French, there's a German minister in Southeast Asia each month that visits Southeast Asia. A French minister in Southeast Asia at best each quarter or each semester. So the level of engagement is not the same. The level of understanding is not the same, and that needs to be improved. And as a corporate head, I share the idea that corporate head has to be optimistic but realistic. But optimism consists in knowing the people. We have to know Malaysia better. We have to spend time there and not through video conferences. A few minutes for questions from the room. 2 questions, yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for this debate. We didn't address India. We didn't talk about India, the relationship between India and China, especially in terms of tensions. We're talking about world balance. I would like to know your opinion on this relationship. Second aspect is thinking of this new COMAC, the Chinese builder, who will certainly in the future be at the level of Boeing or Airbus, and that will turn the region. People will travel a lot in this region, much more than what we have today. Because it's a highly densely populated region. It will probably develop trade also. François Nicolas, on the tension between India and China, it's obvious. And there have been some victims recently, some in the Himalaya region. So tension is real. There's a very strong competition between these two countries, which doesn't make things simpler when it comes to the regional cooperation. That's why we see that China is participating in some regrouping, and India other regroupments, but they're seldom in the same instances or in the same organizations. Another factor of tension. But I think that in the debate, we haven't talked enough about India, which is now an important player in the region, but which was considered until now as marginal compared to Southeast. Few exchanges between Southeast Asia and India has changed a lot in the recent past. We had at the beginning look east from India. Look east, that's what India said. So, and that was Southeast Asia. They only looked, and this look east policy was transformed into an act, a decree. And so we have much stronger ties between India and Southeast Asia. And India is much better integrated in this network of production networks. If we talked about the company, Chinese company, aircraft, trade, cars. Essential debate today. We know that the Chinese have a production capacity that is superior at a lower cost, so they can export. We'll have custom barriers in Europe, so that the 38 or 40% do not apply. We see that manufacturers in Europe are advancing in a dispersed orders, between the Germans and the French. We don't proceed in the same way. We don't work together. But car manufacturing is very important in terms of employment, so in terms of jobs, so it's critical for the months to come. Marie-Françoise, your reaction? Maybe we take the next question. Before another question, yes. Thank you for this very interesting debate. I'd just like to answer concerning COMAC. COMAC is an aircraft manufacturer that exists since 15 years. and they have just had their first aircraft certified 6 months ago. So we can think that to develop the Asians' airspace, it'll take a few decades before they manage, because you know that the aerospace industry is a sector that tries to work on economies of scale, and they're not there yet. But we know with Chinese it can go very fast. Just one question regarding Taiwan. You said that there are many reasons that lead you to think that there will not be an armed conflict with China. I would like that you develop that, because with my students, for example, I share that opinion, but I don't have the arguments when I talk to my students. So thank you very much for giving me some arguments to that effect. Well, I'll answer, but first of all, I'll hand over the floor to Marie-Françoise on COMAC. COMAC, the objective is that China be less dependent of foreign products. It's not the idea of developing traveling facilities that are already very intense, than to develop a domestic industry that can compete with foreign industries. In Taiwan, now, why I think China will not invade tomorrow? Well, first, the Taiwan Strait is not wide, but it's wide, and you know, debarking is difficult. And in the Taiwan Strait, you have a lot of sea currents. That's what I was told. That would make an attack quite complicated. And there are other political elements that weigh in the balance. I think that Xi Jinping has other things in mind for them. He had other problems to tackle, domestically speaking. So I'm not sure it's a priority for him. So there are two elements I think are important that lead me to believe that it's not for tomorrow. Marie-Françoise, to conclude rapidly, we saw that the Indo-Pacific is not an actor. It's not the Indo-Pacific that can develop a strategy. On the other hand, as far as the Indo-Pacific space, we see that tensions that come from all the world are present, and the stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific region is what will impact the rest of the world, and the stability of the rest of the world depend on that. Thank you, Marie-Françoise. Thank you, Chintong Liu. Thank you, Arnaud Vessier, Denis Berrieux, François Nicolas. Thank you all. Have a very nice evening. Thank you.